It was one of those decisions that seemed brilliant at the time. A group of friends bored and looking for an adrenaline rush decided to explore the abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. Everyone had heard the stories. Strange noises, shadows that moved on their own, and an eerie chill that clung to the air inside the crumbling building. Naturally, those stories only fueled our curiosity. "Come on, it'll be fun," Jake had said, grinning as he held up a flashlight. His enthusiasm was contagious, and before we knew it, we were piled into 2 cars, heading down the desolate road that led to the old St. Mary's Hospital. The hospital had been abandoned for decades, its once sterile halls now a labyrinth of decay and graffiti. Nature had begun reclaiming the building, with ivy crawling up the walls and broken windows, allowing the elements to creep in. By the time we arrived, dusk had settled, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. "This place is way creepier than I imagined," Sarah muttered as we stood in front of the massive double doors. They were ajar, the darkness inside beckoning us like a silent dare. Jake led the way, pushing the doors open with a loud creak. "Let's stick together," he said, his voice echoing down the empty corridor. We switched on our flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness and illuminating peeling paint, broken tiles, and faded signs that once directed patients and staff. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint, metallic smell that made my stomach churn. As we moved deeper into the hospital, the temperature seemed to drop, and an oppressive silence settled over us. Even our laughter and whispered jokes felt out of place. Swallowed by the building's eerie atmosphere, we started in what looked like the main lobby, then made our way to the patient rooms. Each room was a snapshot of abandonment-trusted bed frames, tattered curtains, and medical equipment left to rot. In one room, Sarah found a stack of old patient files, their pages yellowed and brittle. She flipped through one, reading aloud the diagnosis of a patient from decades ago. Her voice wavered as she reached the last line. "Patient discharged due to unexplained disappearance." "Creepy," Jake said, but his grin didn't waver. "Let's keep going." The deeper we went, the more unsettling the hospital became. The graffiti on the walls took on darker toned cryptic symbols and phrases that didn't make sense. "Leave." One scrawl read in jagged red letters. "They're watching," said another. "People probably did this to mess with anyone who comes here," Jake said. But even he seemed less sure of himself now. Eventually, we reached the surgical wing. The large, circular operating room was eerily intact, with rusted surgical tools still lying on metal trays. The overhead light fixture dangled precariously, swaying slightly as if moved by an unseen hand. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered, her eyes darting around the room. "It feels wrong." Before anyone could respond, a loud clatter echoed from the hallway we'd just come through. We froze, our flashlights whipping toward the sound. "Probably an animal," Jake said, but his voice lacked its usual bravado. "Let's check it out," I suggested, though I regretted it the moment the words left my mouth. We moved cautiously back into the hallway, our footsteps sounding deafening in the silence. The beam of my flashlight landed on a rusted gurney that had been overturned. None of us had touched it earlier. My heart raced as I realized something or someone had. "We should leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Not yet," Jake insisted. "We haven't even seen the basement." "Why would we go to the basement?" Sarah snapped. "Have you ever seen a horror movie?" But Jake was already heading toward the stairwell. Reluctantly, we followed. The descent into the basement felt like entering another world. The air grew colder, and the faint smell of rot became overpowering. The walls were lined with pipes, many of them leaking water that pooled on the cracked floor. The only sound was the steady drip-drip of water and our own ragged breathing. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a long hallway. Doors lined both sides, many of them hanging off their hinges. My flashlight revealed more graffiti, but these messages were different. They didn't feel like pranks. One read, "Don't look behind you." I couldn't resist the urge. Slowly, I turned, my flashlight shaking in my hand. There was nothing there. "This is insane," Sarah said, clutching my arm. "Let's go back. Just one more room," Jake said, pointing to a door at the end of the hall. It was larger than the others, with a faded sign that read morgue. "You have got to be kidding me," Sarah hissed. But Jake was already pushing the door open. The room was as horrifying as I had imagined. Metal slabs, once used for autopsies, were arranged in rows. Some were rusted, others covered in dark stains. The drawers for storing bodies were mostly closed. but a few hung open, their contents long gone. The smell here was the worst, a pungent mix of decay and mildew. Jake stepped further into the room, his flashlight sweeping over the walls. That's when we saw it. A handprint smeared in something dark, trailing down one of the walls. It looked fresh. "Okay, we're leaving," Sarah said, her voice firm. She turned to go, but the door we'd entered through slammed shut with a deafening bang. Panic set in. Jake ran to the door, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he shouted. A low, guttural sound filled the room. It was faint at first, like a distant growl, but it grew louder, echoing off the walls. The temperature plummeted, and our breath became visible in the air. "What is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound. Before anyone could answer, the overhead lights flickered and went out completely, plunging us into darkness. My flashlight's beam trembled as I scanned the room, desperate for an escape. That's when I saw Ida's shadow moving across the far wall, impossibly large and shaped like a hunched figure. "Run!" Jake shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The shadow seemed to multiply, filling the room with writhing darkness. My chest tightened as I felt something brush past me, cold and clammy. Suddenly, the door flew open. We didn't question it. We bolted up the stairs, tripping over each other in our haste to get out. By the time we reached the main floor, the oppressive atmosphere had lifted slightly, but we didn't stop. We ran all the way to the cars, not daring to look back. As we sped away, the hospital loomed in the rearview mirror, its broken windows and decaying walls seeming to watch us. No one spoke during the drive home. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken fear and unanswered questions. Later that night, Jake texted the group. "Did anyone else see the handprint on the door when we left?" I hadn't, but the thought of it still sends chills down my spine. Whatever we encountered in that hospital, it wasn't meant to be disturbed. And I know one thing for certain: I'll never set foot near that place again.